guys, welcome to the Adaptive Leadership Summit. This is day 3, and Peyton Jones here, one of the trainers and founders of New Breed, and I'm here with another trainer and founder of New Breed, Andrea Jones. She's my partner in crime, and the only reason that I am actually still going. I'm pretty sure she keeps me out of trouble. But I'm here with Brian Sanders, who really kind of needs no introduction. If you've been paying attention right now in the church, you know that Microchurch is really kind of the talk. Lots of people after COVID starting to kind of check in with Microchurch, hearing about it, taking a lot of the pressure off, being forced to really consider Microchurch as, you know, our structures are being challenged by quick societal changes. And Brian Sanders is the author of The Underground, a book published by Zondervan. Highly, highly recommend it. But I tell people all the time, if I'm talking about Microchurch, that Brian Sanders wrote the book on it. I believe that his book was instrumental in really bringing it to the mainstream church globally, which Brian will probably talk about. A lot of what he's presenting to America has a lot to do with what goes on, on the global stage in the church in the developing world. What we might call microchurch here, a lot of nations and people just call church, and even the early church. Church looked like this for them. Brian also wrote, and I really got to, before I let Brian talk here and get out of the way, before I get into that, there's a book, you can't really see it very well here, and it's probably backwards for you, but, use your secret decoder ring here, or your spy skills. It's called The 6 Seasons of Calling, Discovering Your Purpose in Each Stage of Life. I could not put this thing down. I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy early on, but it was a I can't put down book. I read it cover to cover in one sitting. It just was that good. Brian, I'm going to embarrass you. He's one of the smartest guys I know. Reads, and I'm not exaggerating, somewhere in between 200 to 300 books a year. I think you may have actually crossed a 400 threshold. I don't remember, but every year I look forward to this guy's list of books he reads. He mines through it, and then he goes, these are my top. And I have followed Brian for this on years. He's founder of The Underground, which, according to Alan Hirsch, is the most innovative movement to watch in America at this time. Yeah, he said that once when I was with him publicly. So I broadcast that for you, Brian. But anyways, I just wanted to pause for my train. Interrupted my train of thought there. I just want to introduce Brian to you and share him with you. We have great respect for him. I consider him a friend, and it's an honor to have you here, Brian. Welcome.
Thanks, man. It's good to see you. And so, what a treat to meet Andrea, too. Jeez. Finally.
Well, hey, man, tell us a little bit about Microchurch and why the church adapting towards a microchurch mindset could help them navigate the future.
Well, I'm really actually kind of intrigued by the connection. I don't know that anyone's directly asked me to talk about adaptation and microchurch, although it does feel like that's to some degree what it is in the Western church right now, an attempt to adapt to the changing climate milieu that we're in. But I actually have a lot, I have a lot of thoughts on change, leadership, change management, adaptive leadership, and just that it's maybe a meta skill, a core, maybe one of 2 or 3 core meta skills for the 21st century is, can you learn and can you change? Can you actually adapt in what you're doing? And it's pretty clear right now that change is a part of all of our work. So maybe for some of us it wasn't actually before, or maybe it wasn't so pronounced, the need to be good at change, so central to what we do. But like it or not, this is what all of us are being asked to do, to wade into the waters of change management. I think maybe we're being exposed to some degree by that challenge, that that we aren't prepared for it. We don't actually know how to do that. Um, you know, adaptation was already a core competency, I think, of the 21st century. The sort of, you know, sharing economy, the work of iteration, quick, tight feedback loops, discovering and learning over time, because the rate of change of the world around us, technology, social technology, is too fast for us to just hold on to tested or proven methods. Just it just doesn't work that way. The world doesn't work that way anymore. So like things like master planning, strategic plan, long strategic plans, those things are out. Even in major companies, people just don't do 5-year strategic plans anymore. You can't. One of my favorite book titles is a book called Execution is the Strategy. So you just you have to
Hmm.
go. You have to learn as you go, essentially. We are in obviously a tumultuous time in world history, in American history, and I think change, the ability to adapt and change, is a core competency to survive that somehow. So, but typically, and in more conventional times, the organizations that we've led, the churches and other kinds of organizations, we were asked to lead what has been characterized as what's been called organizations that were dynamically conservative. So if you look at the work of someone like Kurt Lewin, for example, who's kind of the one of the originators of change management theory, Kurt Lewin would say essentially that in organizations that are dynamically conservative, they resist change, and actually change management itself is really about managing resistance.
Hmm.
How do you deal with or manage resistance?
Hmm.
And what Lewin would call modifying the forces of change and resistance to change. So working with those forces, and he would say you do that by reducing the tension between the two, to the need to change and the resistance to change. So, but think of that. So in dynamically conservative organizations, in other words, organizations that want to stay as they are, entities that want to stay, that fight, that are willing to exert energy, dynamism to stay as they are. Um, in those organizations, the diplomat or the coalition builder, they were the people that could embody change. That's that. If there was going to be change, it was going to be sort of run by those kind of people. That's just, I mean, it's just not where we are. So in times of, actually, you can see in the research, in times of crisis and catastrophe, when change is not contested, it's a totally different game. So in other words, let's say you want to, I don't know, move to a bigger church building, and you've got to sort of deal with the resistance of people that raise their kids in that church building, and maybe there's a need for it, but it's like people don't want to hear that because they're emotionally connected, it's sentimental, whatever. And so you need the diplomat to kind of deal with the resistance of that desire to change, right? But now imagine the church burned down. So you went home and you came back the next day and it was gone. There was a fire and it burned to the ground, and so there's nothing left but, like, a classroom or something like that. So that's a totally different game when crisis or catastrophe just takes your thing down, razes it to the ground. Then change is uncontested. You have to get a new building. And I actually really like that as a metaphor for the time in which we live, because, well, whether or not you want to admit the thing that we are, the current container in which the church is held has burned down, or
Yeah.
it's definitely been damaged by a fire. Now you can try to rebuild it as it was. You could try to set up church in the corner over here of what's left of the building, and pretend like it didn't happen. But I also think there's a real opportunity here, because for the first time in my lifetime, this kind of like structural change to rethink what the church actually is and how it operates in the world,
Yes.
and what the story is that's behind it that we tell, is open. I mean, people just feel like, well, this isn't working anymore. This is been shaken so deeply to its core that everybody's a little bit open, that there's if not uncontested change, less resistance to change than there's ever been. So it's also an opportunity. And again, it comes back to the question of like whether we have the competency to navigate that, to move forward. So I do think microchurch is, let's not call it the answer or the change we need to do, but it's an example. It's an example of the kind of change we should be able to pivot into. And some of us are realizing we can, and we are, and other institutional versions of the church are realizing, man, we're just not set up to do this. Even if we're 100% convinced, if all of us are 100% convinced, we're not. So like a crash course here in change, there are basically three kinds of change. There's what's called developmental change, which is like first order change. That is like growing something, improving something. Something already exists, and you try to make it incrementally better. That's developmental change. That's number one. And we're all pretty comfortable with that. So we know, like, oh, we have a church, but it has 100 people now. It has 200 people. We want to grow it to have 300 people. That's change. That's incremental developmental change. That's first order change. Number one. Second is what's called transitional change. Transitional change is second order change. That's to move to something new, to do something new, to add a new program, a new way of looking at the church, a new staff member, a new department, something like that. So it is that's harder. That's second level change, or taking something away. We used to do this program, now we're not anymore. We used to have this big part of what we were, now that's gone. But the third form of change, which I think maybe the more exposing kind of change, is what's called transformational change. And transformational change is reinvention, right? It's comprehensive, it's disruptive change, it's letting go of everything you are and redefining who you are and what you do. It's starting over, essentially. And I would argue that we're familiar with developmental change. We all kind of line up for that. We're a little bit scared by transitional change, but there's always a group of people pushing for that, and we have to manage them, you know. But transformational change is actually very rare, and we don't have a lot of experience with it, actually. None of us that have run organizations or done things. And some people might think they've called for that, for revolution order, but do they actually have experience in leading transformational change? No, it's just not a high level competency that many of us have. So look, I would say that church leaders are fairly unskilled and inexperienced in transformational change, and they usually prefer sort of incremental versions of change, if and when they're even open to it, or even if they like change. But so anyway, that is all sort of a subtext for the question of microchurch and how do we integrate microchurch, and should we, and what is it, and all of that is, to my mind, is in the background. So, you know, but if we're going to talk about microchurches as an expression of adaptive change in the time in which we live, for those of us that love Jesus and the kingdom and want to see a living expression of the church in our time, a living expression of his people in our time, yeah, I mean, microchurches is for my money right there at the front of when those questions are being asked. That's what's percolating in our conversations, in our hearts, in our prayers, and as we listen to our people respond to the time in which we live. It does feel like, you know, the Holy Spirit saying something. So for me, you know, microchurches represent a possible adaptive iteration of the church in our time, because it reflects a new orientation to time. So I want to make that point, like future over past. They represent new structures and our essential relationship to power. So that's a point I would want to make. And it gives us new language to describe the church, something actually that we've always been trying to do, always been committed to do, which is making disciples, you know, demonstrating the good news of the kingdom in proclamation and demonstration of the good news of the kingdom. That microchurches give us new language to do that. So is it okay if I just make those points really quick, Peyton?
Yeah.
Do I have time to do that?
Dude, the floor is yours, and we love where you've been going so far. So keep going there.
So good. So okay. First, this idea of future orientation. So I read this incredible study. It was I think out of Cambridge, 2014, something like that. And they were looking at time orientation in top level leaders. So it's like, actually, I think what they call it was temporal focus. temporal focus. So your time orientation to like CEOs, something like that. So um, they and it was a massive study. It was 221 firms, 19 different industries, multiple countries, and it was longitudinal. So it was like 1996 to 2008 or so. I forget exactly what it was. So it's a long longitudinal study, loads of companies, and they basically were asking the question: all right, which of these guys perform better? Which of these companies perform better based on isolating for the concern of the CEO's orientation to time? I just think this is crazy. So the ones that thought about, always talking about the past, or always talking about the present, here we are now, or the ones that were always talking about the future. And then the question is, which ones perform better, essentially? And what the study uncovered and revealed uh, is that in what they called stable environments, and they were looking at like new product launch, development, speed of development, all those kinds of things. But in what they called stable environments, uh, companies that were led by CEOs with a past and or present focus outperformed the others. But in like crisis environments, in dynamic, what they call dynamic environments, fast, rapid change, it was the opposite. It was the ones with future orientation, future time orientation, and present time orientation that outperformed the ones with past. So it actually makes sense if you think about it. If you're in a kind of market environment where everything is kind of stable and it's been going a certain way, the market exists in a certain equilibrium for many years, then what you do is you look for best practices. You say, well, how do we win in this environment? How do we win in this market? And you look backwards. You look backwards to see, okay, what has worked in the past? And so it makes sense in those stable markets, in those stable environments, that leaders that have that backwards focus, that past focus, they're going to do well because they're going to be learning scientific management, right? Taylorism. You look back and you say, what works? What has worked? What produces results? And so with that past orientation in a stable environment, you're going to do well. But what happens in dynamic environments where it's nothing like it was last year or last week? That the world has changed in such a way that if you keep looking backwards, if you keep looking for what worked last year or what worked last decade, you're going to fail miserably. And so here's the kind of like revelation here. We are in a like a chronic state of dynamic environments. And as far as the church goes, if we continue to have this sort of past orientation, there's nothing wrong with remembering our history or cherishing our theological, doctrinal, whatever heritage. That's massively important and meaningful. But in terms of our leadership, when that is our focus, the way we did things before, we've always done it this way, whatever, that is going to kill us. It is killing us. And so we need something which is a future orientation. Now, part of what I'm saying is that microchurches give us that simply because it feels new. It's a different way of structuring and thinking about, okay, if our church is not 200 people or 300 people, our church is 75 microchurches that are owned by the people that run them. Suddenly that puts us in a position of feeling like a startup, like a day one company, a day one enterprise. And when you're in startup mode, your orientation is always future, because you can't look backwards and say, how did we do it before? We don't have that. We didn't do it this way before. So if for no other reason than this is a fresh iteration of the church, this gives us this future orientation. So that to me, that's a really important dynamic here. The second is our relationship to power. Look, I was just before I got on this call, I looked at another thing with some church, some big church, that there's a scandal or something like that. It just feels chronic. Every day there's something being revealed. Now, whether those things are 100% true or fair or whatever, that's not. I'm not making a point about that, but only to say that our elevation of single leaders, celebrating singular leaders, creating a form of church, a structure of church, which is essentially hierarchical and elevates one or two or a handful of leaders above everybody else, is imploding right now. That approach to what I would say is essentially a relationship to power, a question of how we, manage and think about power is really backfiring. It may have worked in the late 20th century, and I would argue it did actually, but it simply is not working anymore. There's a couple of really good books. A book called New Power by two I think a British and an Australian researcher, Hymans and Timms. A really fascinating book by Argentinian intellectual called Moises Naim, who wrote a book called The End of Power. And actually, in his book, he makes the argument that power is being destroyed. If you think of it almost like thermodynamics or something like that, where is power ever destroyed, or is it just sort of redistributed? And he would say actually there's less power in the world today than there was before. And then of course not only is it being reduced to some degree, but he's saying it's being broken up into what he calls micro powers, which is a really interesting term. By the way, micro is everywhere. I've seen micro schools. Of course, there's micro enterprise, micro business. I just saw an article the other day that these guys bought an island off the coast of Belize or something because they wanted to create a micro nation. So essentially to have their own country, so they don't pay taxes or something like that. So the idea that power being consolidated in big institutions or big entities or big people, that's all being broken down. This is the time in which we live, where that's all being broken down into small, tiny little pieces and redistributed into the world in the form of people. So when we're talking about church, we're essentially asking the question, like, what really is the church? And what is its minimum viable product? What we've called the ecclesial minimum? Um, and everybody should ask that question. It's a brave, important question for our time, and it reorients us to say what really is the question. So I know you like movies, Peyton. So like it's Eye of a Tiger. It's like Rocky. Go back to the beginning. Like what is the church? What was it meant to be? Why do we do this? What is it meant to produce? And what you come up with is a simpler version of the church than what you're currently doing. Now, for me, three things: worship, community, and mission. For somebody else, it might be six things or 14. I don't know, but it's less than you think. It's less than you think. And whenever you figure out what that minimum is, you now have something that you can plant more freely. And I would just say everybody in our time should be figuring out what their ecclesial minimum is, and then trying to see that flourish, try to see more of those spring up in the world. And by doing that, we renegotiate our relationship with power in the world. And it's not just our relationship with the human power, like human leaders, and breaking it down and giving the church back to ordinary people to lead, but it's actually our relationship to the power of God, to the question of what the ontological question of power, like what really is power and how does it work and where does it come from? And what does it mean to set ourselves up as essentially as rivals to the power of God, and to believe that well, in high control environments, like hierarchical environments, we think we have to do this. We have to make sure that there's control, or else things will get out of whack. Doctrine will go bad. Or one of the critiques that I always hear about Microchurch is like, well, what happens when people get an error, or what happens when people do something wrong? Well, guys, plenty of error is also happening in bigger versions of the church. So this is something we're going to have to navigate and negotiate. And I would actually argue that error and abuse and those kind of things is mitigated by the smallness. It has less effect. So if somebody goes wrong, in other words, which is going to happen, human beings are going to sin. It harms less people. It has less of a ripple effect when you've broken it down into these kind of smaller powers. So to me, all of that is really important. And the second really difficult question to ask is this sort of Goldilocks principle of like, what is the perfect size of a church? It's just not something I think is coming out of the church growth movement, and you'll know this really well, Peyton. Like we bought into this idea that bigger is better. Obviously, a church of 500 is better than a church of 200, and obviously, a church of 1,000 is better than 500. What? Why? Like, on what grounds are we making that argument? And maybe it's not an argument that's even needed to be made, because we simply all have believed that at some uncontested level in our own minds. Like, yeah, of course, a 2,000 person church is better than a 200 person church. So I would say that also has to be, we have to re-ask that question and come up with what is our Goldilocks? Like, what is the perfect size church? Which, by the way, I think everybody might have a different answer for. I can tell you for me, it's about 50, 60 people. That feels to me like the perfect size church. And I could make an argument for that and maybe would some other time. But just in terms of, what microchurches give us, they're cheaper. So microchurches outperform bigger churches on a number of, I would say, increasingly important measurements. Not every measurement. I get it, but they're cheaper, they're more adaptive, they're better actually at mission on aggregate, they're better at holistic discipleship actually than planned structured discipleship programs from big churches. They're better at their use of power. This is it mitigates demagoguery. It mitigates there. It's really hard to be a big deal in a microchurch movement. It's hard. It's hard to be a target even in a microchurch movement. Um, they're better at integrating calling, and so empowerment, intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. They're not dependent on visionary leaders. So in other words, people wake up every day and they think, I'm going to go do this because I feel called to go do this, not because somebody has convinced me to do it. Um, and I can make an argument, and I shouldn't because I don't have time, but I can make an argument that microchurches essentially operate as what you could call a superorganism. That is to say, they're unkillable, they're irrepressible. Microchurches like a hill of ants. Like you can smash one or two, it doesn't matter. They'll just move somewhere else. Like you can't. Whereas big churches can be taken down, and we're realizing they can be taken down by one scandal, by one mistake, by one error. They're that fragile, even though they look so dominant. They're actually super fragile systems. Whereas microchurches are, you can crush one microchurch. That's easy. Like you can kill an ant. That's easy. But you can't kill the ant hill. You can't kill the organism itself. And that's more what I think and again, it's a question of power. Where does the power reside in the church? And when it resides with the people, called people by Jesus in them, they're going to make loads of little mistakes and they're not going to be as excellent or as amazing. But the truth is, you have a version of the church which is almost unkillable, almost irrepressible. And the last thing I'll say maybe is just, we're going to need new language to. Part of it is just in every generation we have to refresh these sort of old ways, and nobody does this better than you, Peyton. Like taking these sort of ancient paths and giving them, fresh modern language. We need not just metaphors and stories, but we need to think about the kind of why of what we do, why we do what we do. And I think microchurches ask those questions. It begs those primitive questions that we all need to be asking, and give us new, fresh language. There's a in change theory. There's something called the social constructionist view, and basically the argument is that any approach to change has to involve words and meaning. So you can't actually change something without creating a new social construction of what the thing you're trying to change means, what it is. And so I think that is also something that has to happen. And microchurch helps us with that because it pulls together this idea of something small, something handled by the ordinary people of the church, the people of God, which is the church. And it almost immediately creates that tension and forces us to renegotiate the meanings of those basic words. The English, the British have a saying about somebody who's kind of lost their way or who's acting bizarre or something like that. They say that he's lost the plot. This is something they'll say. And I love. There's an early 20th century novelist called Ian Forster, who has this wonderful way of distinguishing between what he calls a story and a plot. And a story, he says, a story is to say the king died and then the queen died. That's a story. It's just events. The king died, then the queen died. But a plot, he says, is the king died and then the queen died of grief. So a plot suggests a because, a why, a cause and effect. So when the king died, the queen died because she loved the king. So we're Christians. We always know there's a plot to our stories. And right now we are in a sea of scandal and anxiety and disillusionment, and that is our current story. That's, I get it. That's the facts. That's the sequence of events that have happened. A bifurcated country, a world that's being pulled apart by every possible duality that exists. That's our story. But what's the plot behind it? And I think the plot is something more to do with the sovereignty of God. And at least for me, microchurches are a part of remembering the plot in the time in which we live. So I'll leave it there.
Well, first off, Brian, thanks for that, man. I know it's not easy because, when you and I get together and we talk, I'm always conscious that you, like I suppose New Breed, you're speaking to the broader church about things that are not popular. Because essentially you're saying, hey, you kind of got to melt that ice block you're floating on a little bit. And that's never a popular message. So I want to thank you for having the courage. And also, brother, knowing you, just being around you a few times and interacting with you, I also know you have a very much a kind of prophetic burden and even gifting to us to a. I'll never forget being in an event with you in Long Beach, and the first session ended, and you came in and you're like, I just, real humble, but just I just I just want to ask, what what are we here trying to do? All the leaders were stunned, like nobody asked that question at these events. And I remember thinking, it was one of the first times I think it was the second time I met you. I just think, man, I really like this guy. Anyone who's willing to stop and stand back and ask why or what, or just kind of get us refocused back on Christ. That's a big deal, and I know that's a passion. We actually wrote a microchurch course at New Breed Training, and you were heavily quoted in that, my friend. We use your definition, quote you, point people to your books. But one of the things that you mentioned about the past and the future that was really intriguing to me, and talked about how the church is not necessarily great with change because it has this past orientation. In the way that I often think about it, that the connection to the past, we should only be connected to the past in our principles, right? In our methodologies, we should be future and present oriented. And so that's kind of something that I really like that microchurch gives us. It gives us that ability. Like when you boil it down to those minimal ecclesiology, worship, community, and mission, I really see that as like these are the principles. If we could hold on to these three things and hold truly to those, we could do whatever in the heck. It could flesh out, in methodology and even model. Because one of the things that I want everyone to hear, the microchurch allows you this freedom of expression, which really wraps itself around the mission that you're on. Would you say, Brian, that a microchurch really is oriented towards mission, that forms the expression, kind of like we say in plantology, that mission dictates model? Is that kind of what that leads to? Or
Well, yeah, that probably has to be the differentiator between a microchurch and a small group or a life group or whatever. I mean, there's been plenty of iterations of smaller gatherings of Christians, right? And so, how is this any different than that? I think it's 100% has to do with the primacy of mission. The
mm,
not just a bias towards mission, but a beginning with mission. I think if we begin with the pursuit of community, which often our small group cell kind of iterations of the church have done, start off, well, this is our way to make friends, to essentially do that. Well, in some ways that undermines mission actually, because it,
mm,
it says, let's not, there isn't room here for people that aren't our friends, and mission is the opposite, yearning. It's the leaving the 99 to find the one, but if you and I share the same, like we see those skateboarders over there and we think, God, I who's going to reach those guys? I love those guys. I want those guys to hear about
mm,
Jesus, and I want that and you want that, and then we partner up. the irony is we actually get better community, the two of us. We become closer, tighter, better friends than if we just sat around once a week and talked about God or whatever, or our lives or something. So yeah, totally. Mission as the kind of primal beginning to a microchurch.
Nice. Well, guys, look, we are ready to take your questions. So I know we've got a few in here. Feel free to interact with Brian here. We'll take your questions and kind of throw them at Brian, and he'll catch them and pitch them back to us. So one of the questions here, it comes and it says, what would the life cycle of a micro church look like if it wants to stay fresh and new?
Yeah, it's funny. Jeff Bezos has this thing where he says, he wants Amazon to always be a day one company, to never be a day two company. And they do some little silly things. Like, I guess at the beginning of their company, everybody got like a door, like a hollow core hard door from Home Depot, just like one of those cheap. And that was your desk. So like you put it on sawhorses, and that's what everybody. And still to this day, if you get a job at Amazon, supposedly that's the desk you get.
Wow.
Trying to keep them with that fresh sense of like, we're just a startup. We still need to operate like a startup, with the energy of a startup, with the curiosity of a startup, and so on. So microchurches at their best, I think, do that because they're always changing, they're always learning. So just when they get some traction and some people come to faith, or some baptisms happen or something like that, you really love each other, people within that community feel called to start new things. And so you're, in a sense, that group is always sending people, and there's that if it's healthy, there's always a sending and there's always a restarting. And maybe in that sense, microchurches feel more like nature. It's like seasons of winter and spring and summer and fall, and a good microchurch has that renewal. One of the practices that we would have done in our community is actually have people take summers off, and not do their microchurch if they could. Some depending on their mission and stuff, that wasn't possible, but precisely to give it that sense of like, when the fall rolls around, it's a startup again, and to keep that renewed zeal and renewed energy. And probably bigger churches try to do that too. It's just harder, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that we almost annually re-looked at everything, because mission was the kind of the driving force. We changed all the time what we were doing and how we were doing it. Andrew, you had something.
Oh, that was it. That was my question. What does the life cycle of the microchurch look like? And I think what we've seen, we used to say that if all churches have to always have groups, 10 years down the line, because that's what we did in the beginning, then we've missed the mark somehow. We've not continued to move and grow and change with what's going on around us. And I think that's sometimes can be the struggle when you do have such a great microchurch, is breaking that up, because you do get comfortable on that mission and you get comfortable with each other, and you get very close with each other, especially when you're on mission. That sometimes you have to continue to break up that ground, and God has a way of doing it if we don't. And I think that's what we see as church divisions. but I think that's something that we're always kind of rethinking, and it's not failure that it's splitting. Sometimes that's what the worm's got to do. Yeah.
Or ending.
Or
That's
ending.
the other thing. Like, legacy churches really struggle to end.
Yeah.
To close their doors. It feels like such a failure.
Yeah.
If this church has existed for 50 years, and then you're the group that gets to preside over its death.
Its death, yeah.
And that's just really, I just think, a misunderstanding of what the church is. It's like, that you are not the church. That's just a building and a group of people in a time in which it was. And microchurches probably do that a little bit better. We still struggle, but not at the level where it's like, maybe it's just time for this thing to shut down. And if it existed for 5 years or 2 years or 6 years, that's awesome. What a run.
Yeah.
And those people will just they'll do new iterations of the church, right?
Yeah.
So I know that we've seen that a lot, where we had very little recidivism, very little loss rate actually, but microchurches were shutting down all the time. But the people in those microchurches were just starting up something else
Yeah.
in its place, and that's to me, that feels very healthy. Like, it's okay to just say, we had a great run here, this was awesome, there was a beginning and there was an end, and let's go do the new thing, or let's half of us will go do this, half of us go do that, and that's beautiful, you know.
Yeah. And I think that's a message that I think people need to hear more, because I know a lot of people that have started micro churches and then it fizzled out, or they feel it fizzled out. It's just that course ran its course, and then they went on to start something new and something different. And it didn't turn out to be a failure. All those people were discipled well. All those people ended up doing mission and going off to do other mission. And so that's the success there. And so, but I don't think that message, we often don't internalize that message as church planters.
Because we want to turn microchurch into a strategy.
Yeah.
You know, we want to say, okay, this is a new tactic somehow. It's not what I mean at all. I just mean like small churches. Let's break it down into its simplest form. So if you want to plant church, let's say you have a big church and you want to plant churches, like a church that plants churches. And let's say you plant 10 churches, and some of them grow to be 200-300 people. They're amazing. And some of them, they're like 40 people. Is there anything wrong with that? I just think, what would be the problem with having a bunch of 40-person churches that you planted? Let them be 40 people. Stop disrespecting them. You know, it's like Americans have a fondness for tall leaders. Did you know that? Did you know that there's one CEO of a Fortune 500 company that is under 6 feet tall?
It's interesting.
Yeah. So we have a huge bias actually towards tall men. Like, they must be better leaders because they're tall. Come on. So what's wrong with short leaders? I mean, so to me, this is as simple as there are big churches, there are medium-sized churches, and there are small churches. We want
my short man syndrome's kicking off, Brian. My short man syndrome.
I was waiting for that.
You're not that short.
5'1". You ever seen Time Bandits where Napoleon's talking about all the short Alexander the Great, Vovatin? He's all excited about it.
We can have 4'10" churches. It's okay.
That's it. And it's so arbitrary to just pick a thing and to say this is a real, like, if your church has 100 people, that's a real church.
Yeah.
You know, but if it has 40 people or 30 people, that's not. I mean, and it's like capacity of leaders and all that stuff is between God and them. It's they're doing the best they can. And in some ways it's a beautiful thing, actually. To not be flashy, to not have hundreds of people come to your thing, but you still show up, you still love the people around you, you're still trying to reach your neighborhood or whatever. We just need more of that, in my opinion, more of those small things.
One of the great things about the Underground Network that you founded was people come to you all the time and they're like, hey, we want to do this. And again, it's how we started this Adaptive Leadership Summit, as we talked about the idea of principles versus methods again, that we are so used to taking borrowed methods and models and trying to cram them into our context. And there's not that internal change and struggle that happens for all of us when things, stuff just isn't clicking, it's not working. And I don't mean that from a pragmatic point of view, but there's a point at which ministry is this like intense walk with Jesus. It should be, where God is discipling you. And through that pain and that struggle, you're learning to lean into him. You're trying to hear from him more. You really have to be attentive. There's a reason the apostles prayed their butts off, despite spending 3 years intensely with Jesus. They prayed. They had learned dependence on the Holy Spirit during that time. And I think what happens a lot, and what I appreciated about Underground, is you guys are very big about giving that caution. Like, hey, don't come to us for a borrowed model. Like, don't come to us for this method. Come to us and we can help you maybe seek the Lord on whether this is something. And if you feel it is, we can help you transition into that. And we appreciate that about you. And I really have always heard you kind of say that. One of the questions is, Here, somebody asks, and I think it's coming from a good place. It says, how would an established church transition into this? And I think that's probably the $1,000,000 question for so many people that are in a context, hearing what you're saying. It's stirring something within them, and they're saying, man, I'm on this ship right now, but I'm looking at that shore going, I don't know how to get from here to there, and that's where I want to get.
I mean, I obviously that's a complicated question, and
In
it
4
will
minutes, Brian.
require well, it will require great effort probably. But I'll say two things. One, first you'll have to see yourself, your traditional church, as a network. In other words, if you look out at the congregation Sunday morning, and so, you're standing on the platform and you look out at your group, maybe it's 200 people, something like that. Do you see 200 individuals, or do you see a network of churches? And I think that's the first thing. It's just like, open your eyes, look at the field. Elijah, Elisha, Jesus, and the woman at the well in Samaria. Just see differently. And actually, if you thought of like, okay, actually the thing you're looking at is a network. It's maybe an unactivated network, and there's lots of little latent microchurches there. They're there to be developed. In fact, they may even be there more obviously. You might say, actually, yeah, those guys do an outreach there, and those guys do work on that, and then start trying to just make that shift in your own mind and thinking about yourself slightly differently. And then I would say, rely on your experience with families. So, for example, most local churches in the previous iteration of church have understood themselves as a collection of families, right? And that's easy for us to get our heads around. Families are autonomous. They have a name, like they have their own name. So you don't go, that is family number 7 of First Church of whatever. That's weird, right? So that's the Joneses. That's who they are. And they get to have their own name, their own head of household, their own, values, their own place, whatever. They're autonomous, named. And then we have thought of the local church as trying to serve, not own, those families, serve those families. And part of how we've done that is by, creating programs that we thought would help families. Kids program, youth program, marriage retreats, those kind of things. So to my mind, we don't think of families as subsidiaries, like small groups owned by the church. We understand that they are powerful, autonomous units that make up the church. If you just use that basic framework, you're not far away actually from seeing yourself as a missional network. And if you reorient it toward the issue of mission, then there are going to be little families committed to certain kinds of mission within your church. And again, to me, 200 people, that's 40 microchurches probably. That is a powerful network of missionary communities. I mean, you got a lot to work with there. Now it's going to take some time to unearth their calling, to really set yourself up to not just provide a youth program and marriage retreats, but to provide different kinds of services for those missionary communities. They'll need something different, but you actually know how to do it. You know what I mean? You actually have done this before, just with a different customer, essentially.
Yeah. So good, Brian. And for those of you that are dropping questions, lots of great questions on here that unfortunately we won't have time to get to today, but I'm going to make you a commitment, and that is we're copying all these questions that did not get answered. We do have the Microchurch course. It's free at newbreedtraining.com. What we're going to do is we're going to add an appendix and answer those. But in the meantime, if you also want to go deep on Microchurch, definitely connect. We cover it because it's what Andrew and I did overseas, but we would say that Brian really is an expert on this. He's done it at a scale that very few have. The Underground is an amazing network. So definitely check out the Underground network And in the meantime, I do want to just mention one more time, you can get Brian's book, Underground, which is very much the story. I love that book. It is fantastic. He also has a book called Microchurches, A Better Way. You can get these on Amazon. Exponential does the Microchurches book as well. And the 6 Seasons of Calling by Brian, that just came out. It is absolutely brilliant. And no matter where you're at on your journey, you're in here. He covers those 6 seasons and you're going to be in there. And it was, like I said, it was a can't put me down kind of book. And there is greatness in the room. We're about to go on our break, but I'm just going to say Ralph Moore has just turned up in the green room. And
Ralph
I
has
feel
entered
like
the building.
that's it. We've got Brian and Ralph in the same spot. I don't know. I think we should keep you two separated or dangerous things happen.
Look
But,
at you. What's up, man?
Hey, good to see you. I
Such a
missed
treat.
you. Glad to have you back in our country.
It's good to be back.
Yes, the Irish did not deserve you. We love them deeply, but they're not Welsh. They're Celts. That's why they get a pass, but they're not Welsh. But hey, guys, we're going to go on a quick break and definitely check out the things that we mentioned and join us in about 4 minutes for Ralph Moore and Larry Wackemeyer. And we're going to continue this conversation. Thanks again to Brian for joining us.
Yes.
And we'll see you guys after the break.
Peace.
Bye-bye.